Okay, third video in the truth of the AR-15. And here we're going to discuss philosophy, the reasons why the video is necessary. And that's because people want to use these untruths to push an agenda related to law and ownership. So that's the unfortunate truth of it. And the reason people do that is because, unfortunately, bad people have done bad things with firearms. But here's the truth of the matter. If you were to ban AR-15s tomorrow, and then magically poof every AR-15 out of existence, if somebody wanted to do something bad with a firearm, they would just go find a different firearm. Because so many firearms function basically exactly the same. They just look different. Many of them fire even bigger rounds that are more potent, such as this. And theoretically, even more deadly, potential for more death. So that's the philosophy of it. If you want to argue that firearms themselves have no place in society, that's a different discussion entirely to have, rather than we should ban this specific one because it's particularly bad. As I've shown in the other videos, it's not special. It's not more powerful. In fact, it is on the weaker side, power-wise, of when it comes to rivals. And it does nothing special to make it extra deadly or more significantly more effective in any way. Not that can't be duplicated or done with any other type of rifle. So that is my take on it. I would also argue that for those who say that firearms have no purpose, I would say until humanity ceases to prey upon each other and inflict violence upon each other in order to get their way, firearms will be necessary. And I do not believe that a government should be the sole owner of the ability to inflict significant violence. Because I feel that any government, given that amount of power, with no check in that power, will eventually degrade into a government that oppresses its people. People want to say that you can never fight the US government, blah, blah, blah. There are too many of them. Here's the thing, they got too many of them. They got bombs and tanks and planes. Well, all of those organizations in the Middle East would argue that you can do plenty without having tanks and planes. Second, do you really think everybody in the military is going to just blindly follow orders and start firing on civilians, even ones that have been labeled terrorists by the government? Many of them will probably sympathize with the cause in such a situation and would defect, probably taking a lot of their firearms and munitions with them when they do, even all the way up into the commanders and generals. It would be absolute chaos that I hope never to see in this country. So but it wouldn't be such a lopsided fight as to be impossible for civilians to resist against the government. Like I said, I hope such a thing never happens. It's not something I want to see happen. But if you get complacent and think it'll never happen, that's when you're in trouble. And I'll say that once society reaches a point in which firearms are no longer needed, we cease also needing to regulate them now, don't we? Because at that point in time, bad things won't be happening with their use, and they can be used for pure sport reasons, like we do with archery and things like the javelin throw, which are spears and, of course, bow and arrow archery, which these sports, where they were started as demonstrations of battlefield prowess, how well they can shoot a bow, meaning how well could they shoot that bow on the battlefield. Javelin, how far could they throw their spears when they're in battle. So that's where we stand with that. Now, beyond that, if we got rid of all the firearms everywhere, no governments, no civilians had firearms, people who wish to do bad things would still find ways to do bad things. They have done so. The most recent examples, as the making of this video, is the man in Japan who assassinated the, I think, former prime minister who was running for re-election, or not re-election, but again to be elected again, because I think he ceased for being a prime minister for a little while. He made a homemade firearm. Not just the firearm, but the gunpowder. All of it completely homemade. Gunpowder, old black powder style gunpowder, is 3 ingredients. All 3 are available in any grocery store that is reasonably well stocked, with a cosmetics aisle and a section for grilling and barbecues. So I'm not going to discuss how, but it's not hard to find. And then he just bought a handful of parts at a hardware store and built a homemade gun. Threw ball bearings down the end of it and used it to kill a man. But let's get away from firearms entirely. Also in Japan, just a few years ago, a man killed 80 people because he brought some gasoline in a big jug and lit a small office building on fire and somehow barred the exits so people couldn't leave easily on the ground floor and things like that. It made it basically impossible for people to escape. So many people died from both the fire, and most of them died from smoke inhalation. But 80 people died. Of all things that this person attacked, it was a company that makes anime. And it wasn't a company that made anime that was violent or egregious in some way that you may envision invoking anger. They made anime that was lighthearted, everyday kind of thing, you know, friends and families and, you know, them getting along or having fun. But he still attacked them. I don't recall why. I don't know if they ever found out why. But he killed 80 people with gasoline. A few years before that, in France, a man rented a large box truck, similar to like moving trucks that you see on the road, and drove it down a pedestrian walkway area where no vehicle traffic should be. He drove this truck down through the crowd. I think he killed around 80 to 90 people and injured another around 150. That matches or beats some of the worst firearms attacks that have happened in the US with a truck. Anybody can go rent a truck. Actually, not too long ago, a man drove a SUV through a crowd at a 4th of July celebration and killed a few people. It's not hard to inflict a lot of injury and death for those who want to do so. Currently, firearms are popular, especially in the United States, because they're available. Yes, the AR-15, while rarely used in actual crime, it is occasionally, I guess, but usually not very often in like typical crime, I should say, not actual, but typical crime, is the media, video games, movies, things like that. This is the latest kind of the mystique of the military, things like that. It gets glorified in these mediums, so therefore it gets popularized. That's what they choose. They could choose something else, possibly something that has more potential for inflicting death due to firing something more powerful, but this is the current, I guess, popular only because of media and its place within culture. Now, during the 1994 assault weapons ban, which, as I stated before, didn't actually ban anything, but back then there were very few people who made ARs for civilian sale, so they were fairly expensive back then, much more expensive than now generally for your average price, I should say. So the worst incident we had during that time frame, the guys who did it bought cheap little rifles that fired 9mm pistol bullets. I believe it was. I know they were little pistol caliber firing rifles. They were of a relatively cheap manufacturer. And 9 is not known to be particularly potent. Unlike some people say, you're not going to blow somebody's lung out with it. But they cause a lot of damage even with a fairly weak round, because bullets can be deadly. And when responses, the police can't get there in time, and they don't have the ability to stop these people, first responders, medics can't get in to save people. A lot of these people end up dying from blood loss, not immediately from getting shot. Recent events in Texas have shown us that. Several of the people were said to have lived after being shot for over an hour. But due to the massive delays in response from the police in stopping the person, some of these people sat there bleeding for all this time and then died. They could have been saved had the police acted quicker. So, as you can see, firearms, yes, they can be used for bad things. They are not the only thing that can be used for bad things. People who wish to inflict harm will find a way with something simple and mundane as a truck, a 5-gallon bucket of container of gasoline, things like that. And you can't stop it. It's going to happen. You can't prevent people from doing bad things, unfortunately. So that's where it matters. That's why it matters. We can't blame what is the tool used, because they'll find another tool. And also, related to the Second Amendment and the rights within this country, They were given for a reason. From my understanding of all the reading, it was because the founders expected able-bodied adults to have a firearm available so they could be called up and used for emergency, as in an emergency, to help defend the country if need be. The general population was considered a militia, and they could be called into service and put under the command of a commander and given some basic instruction and sent to do that. Look at what they did in Ukraine. Civilians were being taught the basics of modern combat over the course of a couple weeks. Volunteers, they would show up over a few days or a week or two, learn the basics, and they would help fight. It's not, hopefully, very unlikely to happen in the US, but that was the idea of it. And I still think it's a valid reason, even if it is unlikely. But the other reason was because of the founders wanted to ensure that the government couldn't be the sole source of violence, and that the civilians could, if need be, take down the government if it was to step out of line. Once again, something I hope that never has to happen. But even if it never happens, if you say it can never happen, like I said, that's when you get in trouble, because you get lax and you decide the civilians don't need firearms anymore, and that's when the government is no longer constrained and can devolve into something that we do not want. So hopefully that explains a few things about the philosophy of it. Not everybody's going to agree. That's fine. I know some people don't like firearms at all. That's fine. I just don't think that you should vilify a single firearm. If you want to vilify all firearms, that's another topic. Like I said, we can discuss that. So, like I said, hopefully you learned something, and that's all.